Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine two of the world's most populous nations, neighbors for millennia, yeah, yet still locked in this argument over where their land truly begins and ends. It's a conflict that feels ancient, stretches back centuries, but its flashpoints, the skirmishes, the military buildups, are disturbingly modern. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the deeply entangled history of the India-China border dispute. It's a story of lines drawn on maps, profound betrayals, and the immense ongoing challenge of finding peace where these deep historical grievances, well, they still fester.
And our sources for this deep dive, they give us something pretty rare, actually. A direct look at both the Chinese and Indian perspectives on that pivotal 1962 border war. And it's more than just recounting events. They give us, like, a thousand-year historical context. And critically, a proposed roadmap for how these two giants might actually move forward. So our mission today, really, is to navigate these often, conflicting narratives, uncover the deep roots of the friction, and understand why this border remains one of the most volatile and strategically significant in the world. It's about peeling back those layers of history to illuminate the present, maybe even glimpse some potential futures.
Right. And you might be thinking, okay, why should I care about a border dispute from, 60 years ago, thousands of miles away?
Mhm.
But understanding this history is absolutely crucial. Crucial to grasping current geopolitical tensions that ripple across the globe. I mean, from global trade relationships, regional power dynamics, even the future of Asia itself. This flashpoint has really far reaching implications. It's about getting to those aha moments,
Mhm.
the ones that help you see the bigger picture, not just for India and China, but for the evolving global balance of power and how complex international relations are managed, or sometimes mismanaged. So when we look at the 1962 Sino-Indian War, what immediately leaps out from our sources, it's just not a difference in opinion, is it? It's almost as if two completely different events happen, depending on who you ask. And our sources, they lay out these starkly contrasting views in, well, fascinating detail. It's like a masterclass in how national narratives can diverge so completely over the very same set of facts, creating this chasm of mistrust that, frankly, persists to this day.
It really does. And from the Chinese perspective, the 1962 war is, well, it's overwhelmingly framed as defensive counterattack. Their narrative asserts the war was a direct, almost unavoidable consequence of India's what they call the forward policy and a perceived territorial encroachment by India into areas China firmly believed were its own. So from Beijing's viewpoint, it wasn't aggression. It was seen as a necessary, maybe even reluctant response, a response to what they considered persistent Indian provocation. It was about reestablishing control, not conquering new land.
Okay, so let's dive into that Chinese historical context then. What are their core claims? I mean, where do they genuinely believe their territory actually extends, especially given the history?
Well, China consistently maintains that both Aksai Chin, that's in the western sector, and significant parts of what is now Arunachal Pradesh, which back then was known as NEFA, the Northeast Frontier Agency. They maintain these have historically been Chinese territory. They point to a long historical association, often one defined by zones of influence rather than those fixed modern borders we think of now. Asserting these ancient claims over regions they see as integral to their national identity and, importantly, their security.
And what about that G219 highway? Our sources mention it as being critically important. Why was a road just an infrastructure project, seemingly? Why was it such a flashpoint it could contribute to a war?
Yeah, the G219 highway. Built by China in the mid-1950s, it was seen as absolutely vital for China's national integration and internal security. Really vital. This road provided a critical all-weather link between two hugely important, vast, and often hard-to-access regions, Tibet and Xinjiang. For Beijing, ensuring control and connectivity to these remote areas, especially after they integrated Tibet in 1950, was paramount, crucial. India, though, discovered its construction later, protested vehemently because, well, it ran right through Aksai Chin, a territory India claimed as its own. China viewed India's objections as basically unwarranted interference. They saw the road as an internal matter within its established territory, a symbol of their assertion of sovereignty. This covert invasion, as India perceived it, was an early and profound rupture of trust. It really shows how seemingly internal infrastructure projects can become major flashpoints when those fundamental border definitions are unresolved.
This forward policy India supposedly had, how did China see that as aggressive? Especially when India insists it was purely defensive. It's a classic case, isn't it? Two completely different interpretations of the same actions.
It really is. Chinese narratives specifically assert India adopted an aggressive forward policy by establishing military outposts beyond what China considered its own claimed boundaries, particularly in the western sector. Beijing saw these Indian outposts not as defensive, but as direct intrusions into Chinese claimed territory. Mao Zedong and other Chinese leaders reportedly viewed this as overtly provocative and expansionist behavior by India, a challenge that in their view required a forceful response. They saw it as India trying to unilaterally push its claims forward, changing the status quo on the ground.
And the Dalai Lama, his flight to India. I mean, from India's side, it looks like a humanitarian act. How did that play into China's perception of India's intentions? How did it fuel the animosity?
Oh, hugely. The 1959 Tibetan Uprising and the Dalai Lama's subsequent flight to India, that severely damaged Sino-Indian relations from China's perspective massively. Beijing viewed India's decision to shelter the Dalai Lama not just as humanitarian, but as direct interference in its internal affairs, end quote. They saw it as a profound challenge to Chinese sovereignty over Tibet, an act that, in their eyes, stoked Tibetan separatism and undermined Beijing's authority in a highly sensitive region. This just deepened China's suspicion of India's true intentions, leading them to believe India maybe harbored ulterior motives regarding Tibet.
So it wasn't just about the physical borderline then. It was about a deeper mistrust of India's regional ambitions. Our sources say Chinese officials believed Nehru had hegemonic aspirations. What did that actually mean to them, and how did it influence their actions?
Precisely. It went beyond just lines on a map. Chinese officials at the time, yes, they believed India's Prime Minister Nehru harbored what they termed hegemonic aspirations in Asia. They perceived Nehru as envisioning India as a civilizational leader, specifically of the non-aligned world, aiming for a prominent, maybe even dominating role in the region. Furthermore, China viewed India's famous Panchshel policy of peaceful coexistence, mutual respect, non-aggression, as mere rhetoric that masked real territorial ambitions. They felt it was a facade for India's underlying expansionist goals, a clever way to assert influence without, perhaps, outright aggression. This perception of Nehru's ambitions, it was a significant factor in China's growing distrust, and ultimately their decision-making leading up to '62.
It's almost jarring, though, to hear China describe 1962 as a defensive counterattack or a limited punitive campaign, especially knowing the devastating impact it had on India. How do they reconcile that narrative with the scale of their advance and the fact they inflicted such a crushing defeat?
Well, from Beijing's perspective, this was framed as a decisive but restrained show of strength. They advanced quickly, inflicted significant losses on Indian forces, yes, but critically, then they voluntarily withdrew their troops back to their pre-war positions, particularly in the eastern sector. This unilateral withdrawal was presented as a clear signal from their side that China had no long-term territorial ambitions in those areas. It was purely a corrective action, a teaching moment as they saw it, to force India to respect their claimed boundaries and come to the negotiating table. They aimed to demonstrate military superiority and political resolve, not, they argued, to occupy territory long-term.
And how did China spin this afterwards diplomatically? Did the rest of the world just buy this narrative of a limited operation?
China presented its unilateral ceasefire and withdrawal as basically irrefutable evidence of its peaceful intent and limited objectives. Beijing emphasized the war wasn't the beginning of long-term hostility. Instead, it was framed as a corrective action that became necessary because, they perceived, India kept refusing to negotiate on border issues. They were essentially saying, look, we were forced to act to assert our sovereignty, but we don't seek further conflict.
Oh.
Globally, well, it certainly raised eyebrows, absolutely. But China's swift withdrawal did likely prevent the kind of wider international condemnation that might have followed a prolonged occupation.
What's really interesting, though, is how this war is portrayed in China today. Our sources say it's rarely emphasized in public media or textbooks, unlike, say, the Korean War. Why the historical silence, or at least the downplaying, of such a decisive victory?
It's true, it's quite noticeable. Unlike other conflicts, like the Korean War, which is heavily emphasized, the 1962 Sino-Indian War is rarely emphasized or glorified in official Chinese public media or textbooks. When it's referenced, it's consistently portrayed as a legitimate response to Indian provocation and a necessary assertion of China's territorial rights. It's not presented as a grand conquest, more like a justified defensive measure to protect China's sovereignty. The downplaying might stem from a desire to focus on more, shall we say, heroic or nation-building narratives, or perhaps to avoid appearing overly aggressive on a border that remains, deeply contentious. And crucially, China continues to oppose India's claims over Arunachal Pradesh, referring to it as South Tibet, which just underscores the enduring nature of their territorial claims in the East, despite the relative historical silence on the war itself.
That's a really powerful contrast. Okay, let's flip the coin now. Let's explore the Indian perspective, which, as our sources show, views the 1962 war in a dramatically different light. India sees itself as the victim of unprovoked aggression by a powerful neighbor that betrayed a policy of peaceful coexistence. This really highlights the depth of disagreement and, well, the enduring trauma.
Indeed. From India's standpoint, the narrative is one of profound breach of trust, a shocking act of aggression. India views itself as having been attacked without justification, fundamentally violating the very spirit of friendship and international norms. Norms they believe they had painstakingly cultivated with China. This perception of betrayal has deeply shaped Indian strategic thinking and foreign policy ever since. It fostered this deep-seated suspicion that has proved very, very difficult to dislodge over the decades.
So, what were the historical boundaries India inherited after independence in 47? Was the McMahon Line always seen as a clear, accepted border for India, or was it maybe a point of contention even within India's own understanding back then?
Well, India inherited these colonial-era boundaries after 1947, and it largely accepted them as its legitimate frontiers. A key one, yes, was the McMahon Line in the eastern sector. This corresponds to modern-day Arunachal Pradesh, then Nepal. This line had been negotiated by the British with Tibet back in 1914. India considered this a valid, established boundary, arguing that Tibet at the time had the authority to agree to it. Furthermore, India firmly views Aksai Chin in the western sector as an integral part of the Ladakh region. India's argument is that China had no historical claim over Aksai Chin until after China occupied Tibet in 1950, which effectively expanded China's physical borders to meet India's claimed ones. For India, these weren't disputed territories until China actively started challenging them.
Our sources highlight the betrayal of Panchil and the Hindi-Chini bye-bye era. This implies a period of huge optimism, right? A vision of Asian solidarity that was just brutally shattered. What was that period actually like, and how deep was the shock when it all collapsed?
Oh, it was a period of great idealism. Fervent hope, really, especially for newly independent nations charting their own course after colonialism. India had been a strong advocate for the People's Republic of China's entry into the UN, a big supporter, and it officially recognized Chinese sovereignty over Tibet in 1954. The Panchil Agreement, signed that same year, advocating mutual respect for territorial integrity, non-aggression. That was seen as a real pinnacle of India-China friendship, a blueprint for peaceful coexistence in a decolonizing world. The popular slogan, Hindi-Chini bye-bye, meaning Indians and Chinese are brothers, truly captured this optimistic, almost you could say naive spirit of brotherhood. So from India's viewpoint, the 1962 war was just devastating, an unforeseen betrayal of this hard-won spirit of cooperation, a shattering of a hopeful vision for Asian unity that left incredibly deep scars on the national psyche.
And the road in Aksai Chin, from India's perspective, that wasn't just a border issue, was it? It became something much more sinister, a fundamental violation of trust, almost like a clandestine invasion.
Absolutely. The discovery in the late 1950s that China had built a road through Aksai Chin, territory India considered its own. It was a profound shock, a source of real outrage. India viewed this not merely as a border transgression, but as a covert invasion, an act carried out secretly, without any diplomatic notification, no discussion, deep within what India considered its undisputed territory. This secretive construction just fueled deep suspicion about China's true intentions and its commitment to peaceful relations. It laid bare a fundamental disagreement that had been simmering beneath the surface of all that Panchil rhetoric.
How did India view its decision to shelter the Dalai Lama, especially when China saw it as such a hostile act? It really highlights a clash of values, doesn't it?
Fundamentally, India believed it had a moral and humanitarian duty to offer asylum to the Dalai Lama in 1959. Following the Chinese crackdown in Tibet. From India's perspective, this was a matter of principle, a humanitarian imperative rooted in its own democratic and compassionate values. Not political interference, it was an act of refuge, not aggression. However, as you noted, China interpreted it very, very differently, seeing it as a direct hostile act and a profound challenge to its authority over Tibet, which significantly worsened already strained tensions and, in Beijing's eyes, kind of validated their suspicions about India's supposed hegemonic intentions.
In India's forward policy, which China described as aggressive, it was seen very differently by India itself. How so? And how did these two conflicting interpretations lead so directly to military confrontation?
Well, India firmly maintains its forward policy was designed to reassert control over its own territory, not to provoke China or expand its borders. They argue that the military outposts they established were strictly within what it considered its undisputed boundaries. based on British-era maps and its own understanding of the frontier. So while China saw these as aggressive intrusions into their claimed territory, India saw them as legitimate defensive deployments to secure its own land, consistent with its inherited maps and understanding. This fundamental disconnect in understanding each other's actions became, tragically, a prelude to the 1962 conflict, a miscalculation on both sides, perhaps, of the other's intent.
The war itself, India describes it as a surprise attack. What's the significance of that specific characterization, and how did it impact India's military and political leadership at the time?
That characterization, surprise attack, is absolutely central to India's narrative, deeply embedded in its national memory. On October 20th, 1962, China launched a coordinated attack on Indian positions across both the eastern and western sectors. India believed this attack was premeditated and not, as China claimed, just a reactive measure to Indian movements. The Indian army was, tragically, underprepared and outgunned, leading to a humiliating and swift defeat, especially in Arunachal Pradesh, NIFA, where Chinese forces advanced deep before their withdrawal. The sense of being caught off guard, of a planned aggression by a supposed friend, it inflicted deep psychological scars and profoundly shook India's confidence in its non-aligned foreign policy and its military readiness.
And China's unilateral withdrawal. China framed it as this magnanimous gesture of peace, but India viewed it as purely tactical. Why such a stark difference in interpretation, especially given it looked, well, on the surface, like a de-escalation?
Yeah, from India's perspective, China's unilateral withdrawal was seen as tactical, not genuinely generous or a real sign of peaceful intent. India believed that China withdrew only after it had militarily made its point, demonstrating its military superiority and forcing India to acknowledge, at least in practice, China's de facto control over Aksai Chin. India concluded that China's true goal was to redraw the line of actual control, LAC, unilaterally, and unequivocally assert dominance along the border, effectively establishing a new de facto reality on the ground that favored Beijing. They saw it as a calculated move, achieve specific military and political objectives, then withdraw to avoid international backlash for prolonged occupation. This war clearly had a profound impact on India's national psyche. Our sources mention Nehru's leadership and national trauma. How did it affect India internally, and what were the long-term consequences for its defense and foreign policy? Oh, absolutely profound. The war shattered India's self-image, significantly diminished its stature as a leader of the non-aligned movement on the global stage. Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru's government faced immense criticism for what was perceived as a severe misjudgment of China's intentions and for leaving the Indian army ill-equipped for such a conflict. The defeat was a deeply traumatic event for the young nation, fundamentally altering its strategic outlook. It led directly to massive defense reforms, a shift towards greater military preparedness, and fundamentally shaped a long-term suspicion of China that, well, it persists to this day. It was a rude awakening to the harsh realities of geopolitics, replacing a lot of idealism with a newfound pragmatism.
And the dispute continues, right up to today. No closure, no agreed-upon lines. What are the current core claims that keep these tensions alive?
Indeed, the border dispute remains very much alive, right at the heart of the bilateral relationship. India continues to claim Aksai Chin as illegally occupied by China, viewing it as an integral part of its territory that was forcibly taken. Conversely, China maintains its claim over Arunachal Pradesh, referring to it as South Tibet, a claim India firmly rejects, asserting it's a full-fledged Indian state. The line of actual control, LAC, remains largely undefined and undemarcated on the ground, leading to persistent tensions and regular standoffs, like the deadly 2020 Galwan Valley clash, which tragically resulted in casualties on both sides, underscoring the ongoing volatility and the very real human cost of an unresolved border. What's truly fascinating here, maybe the biggest takeaway from this section, is how the very same historical events are interpreted so radically differently by Beijing and New Delhi. One side sees defensive action, a necessary correction. The other sees blatant, unprovoked aggression and profound betrayal. This isn't just some historical debate, it's the very foundation of ongoing mistrust, a foundational aha moment, really. You can see how these deeply ingrained, opposing narratives prevent either side from fully accepting the other's version of history, making any path to resolution incredibly difficult. The past isn't just past, it's a living force. It shapes current actions, perceptions, and prevents a genuine reset in their relationship.
So, given this deep-seated historical animosity, these profoundly different narratives, how did we even get here? To a point where two nuclear powers can't agree on where their shared border is? To truly understand this, we need to go back, far beyond 1962, even beyond the British Raj, into a time when borders simply weren't conceived of in the modern cartographic sense. It's a journey through shifting zones of influence, not fixed lines on a map.
You're hitting on a crucial point there. For much of history, particularly before, say, the 17th or 18th centuries, there were truly no fixed national borders in the modern sense in the high Himalayas, not like we understand them today. Instead, the region was characterized by fluid zones of influence, where various local kingdoms held sway and complex tributary relationships defined political interactions. Think of it less like modern countries with hard borders and more like a loose hierarchy. Smaller kingdoms paid homage or offered gifts to larger powers, acknowledging influence rather than being fully absorbed. This fluidity meant that direct, clearly delineated India-China borders rarely existed, because Tibet acted as this vast, quiet, natural intermediary.
So if there weren't fixed borders, what was Tibet's role in all this? Our sources describe it as a crucial buffer zone.
Exactly. Tibet functioned as an independent cultural and political entity for a significant period, often operating with considerable autonomy from both its larger neighbors. It effectively served as a geographical and civilizational intermediary between the vast empires and diverse cultures of India and China. Contact between these two civilizations was limited, primarily occurring through ancient trade routes, like segments of the Silk Road and various trans-Himalayan paths, or through pilgrimage by Buddhist monks traveling between centers of learning. Diplomacy also played a role, sure, but direct political conflict between what we now understand as India and China was rare. Rare because of this substantial Tibetan buffer. That tranquility, though, it was shattered. Shattered as the world's great empires began to cast their long shadows over the Himalayas.
That makes perfect sense. Then we move into the Age of Empires, roughly the 17th to 19th centuries. King expansion in China, the arrival of the British in India. This must have started changing things significantly, bringing in that Western concept of fixed, defined borders.
This period marked a crucial and ultimately permanent shift.
Yes.
Yes, the Qing dynasty, ruling China from 1644 to 1912, began asserting stronger control over Tibet by the early 18th century. They wanted to solidify their western frontiers. Meanwhile, in the Himalayan region, kingdoms like Ladakh, Sikkim, and Bhutan maintained varying degrees of autonomy, navigating the growing influence of both the Qing and the encroaching British. Our sources mention the 1679-1684 Tibet-Ladakh-Mughal War and the subsequent Treaty of Tingmosgang 1684, which settled boundaries between Ladakh and Tibet interestingly with Mughal mediation. This treaty is one of the few pre-modern references to a more defined, albeit local, border in the western sector.
And this is where the British really come into play, isn't it? Worried about Russian expansion in the Great Game of Central Asia, they started pushing north, basically drawing the lines that would become the basis for today's disputes, often unilaterally.
Precisely. The 19th century was indeed the crucial period for creating what would become modern borders in the region. The British, with their rapidly expanding Indian Empire, were deeply concerned about Russian expansion into Central Asia and Afghanistan. Deeply. Their strategic imperative was to secure their northern frontier against potential rival imperial powers. This led them to push northward and define what they considered the limits of their territory. This was less about existing, agreed-upon lines and more about geopolitical strategy, often involving mapping uncharted territories and asserting claims over vast, sparsely populated regions.
And this push led to the creation of several lines that are still debated today, forming the very heart of the modern dispute. Can you tell us about the Ardagh-Johnson line, the McCartney-MacDonald line, and the McMahon line? Why is each one so significant?
Yes, these lines are absolutely central. You have to understand them to grasp the dispute today. First, there's the Ardagh-Johnson line, proposed by the British in 1865 and later refined in 1897. This line famously placed Aksai Chin squarely within British India. And it's the line that independent India later adopted as the basis for its claim over Aksai Chin. It represents India's maximalist claim in the West. Then you have the McCartney-MacDonald line in 1899. This was a British compromise proposal to China regarding Aksai Chin. Essentially, it recognized the Johnson line was maybe too ambitious and sought to cede some of Aksai Chin to China. However, critically, this proposal remained unacknowledged by China. So it was proposed but never accepted by Beijing, meaning it never became a de jure or legally agreed-upon border. But perhaps the most contentious and enduring is the Simla Convention of 1914. This is where Britain negotiated directly with Tibet to define their mutual borders. And this is when the McMahon Line was drawn, effectively delineating the boundary between Tibet and British India. Modern Arunachal Pradesh, basically. The crucial detail here, the one you absolutely must remember, is that China did not sign this convention. Why? Because it rejected Tibet's autonomy to enter such an agreement without Chinese oversight. Therefore, China has never recognized McMahon Line as a legal border. They see it as an illegal imposition by colonial powers. Despite this, British India began administering up to the McMahon Line, setting the stage for future conflict. The early 20th century just complicated things further. The fall of King China, rise of Republican China, then the Communist Revolution. Immense confusion over who held what claims. During this time, Tibet largely functioned autonomously from 1912 to 1950, acting independently until India gained independence in 47, inheriting these British-administered but often unrecognized by China borders.
Okay, so you have these lines drawn by the British, often unilaterally without Chinese acceptance, creating this potential powder keg. And then, 1950, the People's Republic of China takes over Tibet. Suddenly, this vast, quiet buffer zone just disappears, turns into a direct, volatile border with India. That sounds like the spark that really ignited the modern dispute.
Exactly. That's the turning point. In 1950, China invaded Tibet and integrated it into the PRC, effectively eliminating that traditional buffer. India, in a significant diplomatic move, recognized Chinese sovereignty over Tibet in 1954, hoping this would foster good relations, settle potential border issues through diplomacy, a gesture of goodwill to their new neighbor. However, the opposite occurred. The boundary issue flared up almost immediately and dramatically. This was because China then began building a road through Aksai Chin between 1956 and 1957, territory India considered its own, a fact India discovered later, adding to that sense of betrayal. Simultaneously, China openly rejected the McMahon Line and started claiming parts of Nifa, modern Arunachal Pradesh. All these factors disappear into the Tibetan buffer. China's aggressive territorial assertions, the clandestine road construction, led to rising tensions and culminated in the 1962 Sino-Indian War. So if we connect this to the bigger picture, you can see how the very notion of a modern border was imposed, often without the full, uncoerced agreement of all parties involved. This set the stage for decades of contention.
A tension between historical rights and contemporary facts on the ground. And it raises a really important question for you to consider. When do historical claims, often based on ancient zones of influence, were never precisely delimited, when do they give way to established reality, particularly lines that have been administered for decades by a de facto authority? That's the core of their ongoing deadlock, is a fundamental clash of principles.
The 1962 war may have ended abruptly, but its legacy is very much alive today. Very much. The line of actual control, the LAC, became the de facto border, the reality on the ground. But it's far from a settled, mutually accepted line on the map. Far from it. This brings us right to the core of why tensions persist and why you keep hearing about these dangerous standoffs between these two nuclear powers.
Indeed. The LAC is long, roughly 3,488 kilometers, but its exact alignment is a point of constant contention in three main sectors. In the western sector, that's the Ladakh-Aksai Chin area, India's position is based on the Johnson Line, placing Aksai Chin firmly within Ladakh. However, China has controlled approximately 38,000 square kilometers of Aksai Chin since the 1962 war, and its control aligns closely with its 1956 and 1960 claim lines. Critically, the current LAC here does not match either claim lines, meaning there's a practical reality on the ground that differs from both nations' ideal maps. China controls the territory, but India still adamantly claims it. It's a line of actual control, yes, but definitely not a line of accepted control. That creates persistent friction.
So it's like two different maps overlapping, and the actual line where the soldiers stand is somewhere in between their respective ideal claims. What about the central sector? Is that as contentious? Or is there maybe a sliver of peace in this vast, disputed border?
Not nearly as much, thankfully. The central sector, covering parts of Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh, is remarkably mostly undisputed. The border here is generally based on a customary frontier and long-standing local administrative practices, which have developed peacefully over centuries. There's been no formal treaty to demarcate it, but it has remained relatively peaceful with a clear understanding of where each side's administration traditionally extends. It's a rare patch of calm, often gets overlooked amidst the more dramatic tensions elsewhere.
That's good to hear, a rare patch of calm. But then we get to the eastern sector. That sounds like a whole different story, especially with Arunachal Pradesh. This area seems like a perpetual flashpoint, even after 62.
Oh, the eastern sector, covering Arunachal Pradesh, formerly Nafa and Sikkim, is indeed far more volatile and emotionally charged for both sides. India firmly follows the McMahon Line in this region, claiming the entire territory as Arunachal Pradesh, a full-fledged Indian state, large settled population. China, however, regards this entire area as self-Tibet and staunchly rejects the McMahon Line's legal validity, views it as a colonial imposition. While China claims that it does not fully control this territory, and the LAC here is highly volatile. This sector has been a recurrent flashpoint, witnessing not just the 1962 war itself, but the 1967 Natulan-Shola skirmishes, the 1986-87 Sumdurong-Chu incident, and more recently, the 2020-22 skirmishes at Toan sector. It just illustrates the persistent nature of the dispute and the ever-present danger of escalation there.
That brings us to a timeline of friction since 1947. And looking at it, it's a long list of incidents. Can you walk us through the key milestones that have shaped this uneasy relationship, going beyond just what happened to the impact of each event?
Certainly. The story of friction really kicks off post-independence. From 1947 to 1950, India inherited its British-administered claims. A pivotal moment was 1950 when the PRC established control over Tibet. India then recognized Tibet as part of China in 1954, a diplomatic move hoping for stability, friendship. That, in hindsight, laid the groundwork for future challenges. Then a critical turning point between 1956 and 1957 when China began constructing that G219 road through Aksai Chin, territory India considered its own. India confirmed this significant intrusion only later, sparking serious diplomatic alarm, profound sense of betrayal. By 1959-1960, Premier Zhu Enlai sent letters to PM Nehru identifying China's extensive claim line. Subsequent negotiations failed to bridge the gap. This set the stage for the 1962 Sino-Indian War. China advanced significantly into Neifa and Aksai Chin before unilaterally withdrawing to the LAC, solidifying its gains in the West and asserting dominance. Another important regional development, complicating India's position further, was 1963 when Pakistan, India's rival, controversially ceded the Trans-Karakoram Tract to China. This act was seen by India as a clear affront, adding another layer of geopolitical complexity. Although there was a period of relative quiet, skirmishes resumed, notably in 1967 at Natulan and Chola, and again in 1986-87 at Sumdurong-Chu, all in the eastern sector. These weren't full-scale wars, but sharp, often bloody reminders that the border remained a live wire. More recently, 2017, the Doklam standoff, a 73-day confrontation on disputed Bhutanese territory involving Indian troops. It was a diplomatic chess match, successfully diffused, but it demonstrated the fragility of the peace. But perhaps the most impactful event in recent memory was the 2020 Galwan Valley clash. Truly devastating. Marked the first deaths in decades on the LAC. A tragic loss of 20 Indian and 4 Chinese soldiers officially reported killed in brutal hand-to-hand combat. This tragic incident led to a massive military buildup on both sides, dramatically escalating tensions, and crucially, severely undermined existing diplomatic protocols and confidence-building measures. It shattered the fragile trust painstakingly built over decades. Since then, we've seen continued minor scuffles and ongoing disengagement talks in eastern Ladakh. But also the transfer of hydropower and infrastructure works in Arunachal Pradesh by India, highlighting that both sides are continuing to strengthen their positions, even amidst talks. What's truly striking here, I think, is that even with the decades of interaction, military agreements, diplomatic channels, the fundamental disagreement over the very definition of the border persists. The LAC is a line of actual control, a physical reality on the ground where soldiers face each other. But it is unequivocally not a line of accepted control by both nations simultaneously. And that's the core of the ongoing flashpoints we see. You can draw lines on a map, sure, but if both sides don't agree on what those lines mean, or even precisely where they are, friction, even tragedy are, sadly, maybe inevitable. The constant dangerous dance along an ambiguous frontier, a situation ripe for miscalculation.
Despite these military confrontations, this deep-seated mistrust, there have been decades of diplomatic efforts to resolve this border issue. Our sources show a long, winding road of talks, agreements, and frankly, frustrating setbacks. It's a testament to the immense complexity of the challenge, but also, maybe at times, to an underlying desire to find a peaceful, lasting solution, however elusive that might seem.
Indeed. And the early diplomatic exchanges, they began with immense optimism, almost a sense of shared destiny. In 1954, India and China signed the Panchsheel Agreement. India had gone to great lengths to recognize Chinese sovereignty over Tibet, a significant geopolitical concession. With the sincere hope this gesture would foster mutual respect and lead to a stable border. The phrase, Hindi Chini Pai Pai, meaning Indians and Chinese are brothers, truly symbolized the incredibly optimistic spirit of that era. There was a genuine belief these two ancient civilizations could forge a new path of peaceful coexistence, avoiding those Cold War rivalries.
But then, the border tensions started almost immediately, didn't they? And those hopes quickly faded, culminating in war. What happened during the 1959-1960 border talks that led to such a catastrophic breakdown?
Well, following the Dalai Lama's escape to India and those initial border skirmishes, PM Nehru and Premier Zhu Enlai exchanged letters, even held direct talks. During these 1959-1960 border talks, Zhou Enlai proposed a status quo-based compromise. Basically, China keeps Aksai Chin in the west, India keeps Nifa in the east. A large-scale swap based on existing control. However, India unequivocally rejected this proposal, largely because it viewed Aksai Chin as its own integral territory and couldn't politically concede it. This fundamental disagreement, combined with rising military tensions, mutual misinterpretations of intentions, directly led to the 1962 war, which tragically ended direct negotiations and setback ties for decades. The promising start had collapsed into open conflict.
So after the war, was there just a complete diplomatic freeze? How long did that silence last? And what kind of courage must it have taken to even begin re-engaging after such a traumatic event?
There was a protracted period of no formal diplomatic engagement, for well over 15 years after the 62 war, a deep freeze, a period of profound suspicion, minimal contact. The memory of betrayal loomed large. Relations only began to improve slightly in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Initially through very low-key trade delegations and ambassador-level contacts, this was a very cautious, gradual thaw, taking small, tentative steps towards re-engagement, demonstrating that even bitter rivals eventually recognized the need for some form of dialogue.
And then, in 1988, there was that landmark thaw with Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's visit to China. What was so significant about that visit? And what did it achieve in terms of recalibrating the relationship?
The 1988 visit by Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi to China was indeed a landmark thaw. Absolutely. First visit by an Indian PM in 34 years. It symbolized a deliberate political decision to move beyond the trauma of 1962. Crucially, during this visit, both India and China agreed to set aside the boundary issue for a time and focus on normalizing broader bilateral ties, recognizing its complexity. This was a pragmatic decision, acknowledging the difficulty of the border problem while seeking to move forward on other fronts. It signaled a willingness to de-escalate and rebuild a working relationship, even without a border resolution, a crucial political signal that peace was perhaps possible.
That pragmatic shift led to a period of confidence-building measures, CBMs, right, throughout the 90s and early 2000s. These sound like efforts to manage the border, even if not fully resolve it. Can you break down the key agreements? What was the genius behind them?
Yes, these CBMs were absolutely critical for managing the volatile border and preventing accidental escalation. Really important. The first significant one was the 1993 Agreement on the Maintenance of Peace and Tranquility along the LAC. This agreement was groundbreaking because it formally recognized the LAC as the de facto border, that line of actual control we discussed even though it wasn't legally delimited. Both sides committed to respecting the status quo and avoiding escalation. This was a huge step forward from the post-war freeze. A recognition of reality on the ground that provided a framework for military conduct. Then, in 1996, a more detailed CBM agreement followed. This one explicitly banned the use of firearms within 2 kilometers of the LAC and limited troop numbers, laid down specific rules of engagement. It also established clear procedures for patrols and communication between military commanders. These measures were designed to prevent accidental clashes and build trust on the ground, creating a safety net where human error or misunderstanding wouldn't immediately lead to bloodshed. The diplomatic momentum continued in 2003 with a joint declaration during PM Atal Bihari Vajpayee's visit to Beijing. This led to the appointment of special representatives, SRs, from both sides, tasked specifically with exploring a political framework for boundary settlement. This was a high-level channel for direct strategic dialogue, moving beyond just military CBMs to a more holistic political discussion. And in 2005, they reached what was seen as a major diplomatic achievement, the Agreement on Political Parameters and Guiding Principles. This laid out a crucial framework for eventual resolution. It stipulated that any border settlement should not disturb settled populations, which is particularly relevant to areas like Arunachal Pradesh, and that both sides would show flexibility and make mutual adjustments. While it didn't lead to concrete demarcation, it set out the principles for a future settlement, offering a glimmer of hope for a political solution based on compromise and pragmatism rather than rigid historical claims.
Despite those remarkable achievements in confidence building, our sources show that progress stalled significantly from 2006 to 2017, and tensions started rising again. What went wrong? Why couldn't these CBMs prevent the renewed friction?
Unfortunately, after 2005, despite the SR talks continuing, progress stalled significantly. The CBMs were about managing the border, remember, not resolving it. And the underlying issues remained untouched, really. China, for its part, intensified claims over Arunachal Pradesh, with a particular focus on the strategically important Tawang region, and began actively opposing Indian infrastructure development in border areas, seeing it as strengthening India's hold on disputed territory. Concurrently, there was an increase in border incursions by Chinese troops, notably at Depsang in 2013, Chumar in 2014, signaling renewed assertiveness and a willingness to test India's resolve, straining that hard-won trust.
And then came the Doklam standoff in 2017. That sounded like a major test for the CBMs in the spirit of the previous agreements. What was at stake there, and how was it eventually diffused?
The 2017 Deklam standoff was indeed a critical test, yes. It involved India intervening to oppose China's road-building activity in disputed Bhutanese territory, very close to the India-China-Bhutan trijunction. This led to a 73-day standoff between Indian and Chinese troops, a prolonged, tense face-off in close proximity. While it was eventually resolved via diplomatic disengagement, a quiet withdrawal of troops facilitated by intense back-channel talks. It demonstrated the fragility of the peace and was seen as a real test case for whether the CBMs could prevent outright conflict in a new, more aggressive environment. It showed that even with established mechanisms, a direct confrontation could still arise from perceived infringements.
And then the Galwan Valley clash in 2020 seems to have fundamentally changed the dynamic, leading to a profound breakdown of trust and reversing years of progress. What was the immediate, devastating impact of that incident?
The 2020 Galwan Valley clash was indeed a profound turning point, a brutal shock to the system. It marked the first deaths in decades on the LAC, with the tragic loss of 20 Indian soldiers and 4 Chinese soldiers, officially reported killed. Killed in hand-to-hand combat, remember, without a single shot fired due to the CBMs banning firearms. The immediate aftermath saw a massive military buildup on both sides, dramatically escalating tensions. Crucially, the diplomatic protocols and CBMs painstakingly built over decades were severely undermined. The incident shattered the fragile trust and demonstrated that the border could still be a site of lethal conflict, despite all the agreements designed to prevent it.
Yeah.
It really transformed the relationship from maybe managed competition to deep-seated strategic mistrust. So after Galwan, what kind of diplomacy has been taking place? Has it helped to de-escalate things at all, or are we still essentially at an impasse? Post-Galwan, diplomacy has been extremely active, yes, but under this heavy cloud of deep mistrust. There have been over 20 rounds of core commander-level military talks, focusing primarily on disengagement at specific friction points to reduce immediate chances of clashes. Additionally, the Working Mechanism for Consultation and Coordination, WMCC meetings, held at a diplomatic level, continue to aim for de-escalation and communication. While there has been some disengagement in areas like Pangong Tso, Galwan, and Gogra Hot Springs, critical standoffs remain in Depsang and Demchok. This means that while some immediate flashpoints have been eased, core unresolved issues persist, preventing full de-escalation and leaving a large military presence along the LAC.
And what are the current positions of India and China regarding the path forward? They seem to have very different priorities for how to manage the relationship going forward, almost at odds with each other.
They do, very much so. India's position is quite clear. It demands the restoration of the pre-April 2020 status quo as a precondition for any full normalization of relations. India explicitly links boundary resolution to the broader relationship, asserting that peace and tranquility along the border is a prerequisite for progress on other fronts, like trade or cultural exchange. They essentially say we won't allow business as usual while the border remains unsettled and militarized. China's position, conversely, prefers to decouple the border issue from overall ties. Beijing wants to continue advancing trade and broader diplomatic engagement while keeping the LAC unsettled, largely on its terms. China's maps continue to overtly claim Arunachal Pradesh as South Tibet and Aksai Chin as fully Chinese, signaling no real change in their fundamental territorial claims or a willingness to negotiate them in earnest just yet. Despite these divergences, there are still existing diplomatic institutions and formats. The Special Representatives, SR talks, continue as a high-level strategic dialogue, even if progress is slow. The core commander-level talks manage tactical discussions on troop disengagement. The WMCC handles diplomatic coordination and de-escalation. And finally, NSA meetings and multilateral forums like SKI, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and BRICS summits also provide opportunities for side discussions and broader engagement, though often just on the sidelines. But this raises a really important question, doesn't it? When decades of painstakingly built agreements and confidence-building measures can be fundamentally undermined in a single clash like Galwan, what does that say about the very foundation of trust between these two nations? It's clear that while mechanisms exist, true resolution remains elusive due to strategic mistrust, divergent priorities, and these asymmetric perceptions of history. Both sides come to the table with such fundamentally different understandings of the past and present that finding common ground for a permanent solution is incredibly challenging, almost like they're speaking different languages of history.
Given this incredibly complex, often volatile history, is there even a plausible path to a lasting peace? Our sources actually propose a phased roadmap for resolution, one that requires immense political will, a spirit of strategic compromise, and a willingness to truly break free from the past. It's not an easy road, not at all, but it outlines concrete, actionable steps.
This roadmap is indeed a bold and pragmatic vision, broken down into 4 distinct phases. Starting with the immediate need to de-escalate the current crisis. Phase 1. Freeze the conflict and restore trust, projected for the next 0 to 2 years. The crucial actions here involve achieving full disengagement in all friction points, specifically calling out Debsang and Demchok, where standoffs currently remain. Both nations would need to reaffirm and publicly recommit to all existing confidence-building measures, like those from 93, 96, 2005. Those designed to manage tensions and prevent unintended clashes.
So really getting back to basics. Stopping any new friction points, it sounds like a desperate attempt almost to reset the clock after Gawan.
Exactly, a reset. This phase also proposes establishing mutual buffer zones, monitored either by joint patrol mechanisms or verified through third-party satellite verification, to build confidence through transparency. This would create a physical separation to prevent accidental encounters between patrols. Furthermore, it emphasizes expanding hotlines and real-time communication at both military and diplomatic levels to ensure immediate de-escalation if incidents occur. Critically, it calls for a ban on the construction of any new military infrastructure within a specified distance, maybe 5–10 kilometers of the LAC, to prevent further militarization and perceived provocations. The desired outcome of this initial phase: a definitive de-escalation of the current crisis, and, crucially, a restoration of military and diplomatic credibility and confidence. It's about rebuilding a minimum level of trust necessary for any further, more ambitious steps.
Okay, once that fragile trust is somewhat reestablished, the immediate crisis averted. What's the next step in this roadmap? It sounds like we then move to actually defining the line that's caused so much friction.
That's phase 2. Define the line of actual control, projected for 2 to 5 years. The key action here, and this has historically been a huge sticking point China has resisted, is for both countries to finally exchange maps of the LAC. This is a crucial test of commitment, as map exchange has often stalled previous talks. Following the exchange, the roadmap suggests conducting bilateral surveys using precise GPS coordinates to establish a mutual, agreed-upon understanding of where the LAC runs, what the patrol limits are. The goal is to codify the LAC as a working boundary, meaning it's recognized for practical purposes, without prejudice to final claims. So neither side gives up its overarching territorial stance yet. Lastly, it calls for local commander-level deconfliction drills to embed these understandings and avoid accidental face-offs. The outcome for this phase: a clearly defined, jointly mapped LAC to prevent future misperceptions, reduce friction, and the beginning of building institutional memory of this agreed-upon working line.
Now, this next phase, phase 3, this sounds like the really difficult one, where the hard bargaining, the real compromises would have to happen. Sector-wise resolution and trade-offs over 5–10 years. This is where the political courage is really tested, isn't it?
This is indeed the substantive core, the real meat of the resolution, requiring immense political will. In the Western sector, covering Aksai Chin and Ladakh, the radical proposal is that India may accept China's control over Aksai Chin de facto with nominal recognition. Essentially, acknowledging the reality on the ground, China has controlled it since 1962 in exchange for permanent settlement and security guarantees. This is a significant, painful concession for India, giving up a historical claim. Huge. In return, the potential gain is that China may grant overland transit rights, for instance, through Aksai Chin, for trade and pilgrimage, which would be jointly monitored. This could open up vital routes and historical connections for India that have been closed for decades, transforming a historical loss into a functional gain potentially.
So giving up the claim in the West for practical access and security, that feels like a truly painful but perhaps pragmatic concession for India. But what about the eastern sector? Arunachal Pradesh. That's equally, if not more, sensitive for India, given its settled population, status as a state.
You're right, the eastern sector, specifically Arunachal Pradesh, highly sensitive. The roadmap proposes that in this eastern sector, India retains sovereignty over Arunachal Pradesh, particularly Tawang. Tawang is a highly significant religious and strategic location. In exchange, China may drop its claim to South Tibet. This would be a major climb down for China, relinquishing its claim over a vast populous area. To sweeten the deal, manage the transition, the proposal suggests establishing cross-border economic zones, and shared religious pilgrimage corridors, such as to the Tawang Monastery, may be akin to the Kailash Mansarovar arrangement. This offers China economic and cultural access without sovereignty, a significant face-saving measure perhaps, and a tangible benefit.
And the central sector, which is already mostly peaceful. It sounds like the path forward there is fairly straightforward, formalizing what's already working.
For the central sector, indeed, the proposal is simply to officially demarcate the boundary based on the current peaceful status quo. This formalizes what is already largely accepted and stable, taking it from a customary understanding to a legally binding line. The overall outcome of Phase 3 would be a political settlement of the boundary based on strategic compromise, where each side keeps what it largely controls, but with a mutual face-saving narrative, allowing both to claim a form of victory with some confidence-building gestures built in.
And then the final phase. Beyond 10 years, this sounds like the ultimate ambitious goal. A full legal settlement, a treaty, cementing the peace.
Precisely. Phase 4, legal settlement and treaty, projected for 10-plus years. The actions here involve drafting a comprehensive, formal boundary agreement, including a clearly demarcated border on official maps, detailed border security protocols, and a robust mechanism for joint dispute resolution. Following this, both nations would sign a treaty of peaceful coexistence and border friendship, formally closing this long chapter of contention, laying a groundwork for a new era. Finally, it would require a concerted effort to encourage public narratives emphasizing mutual benefit, historical closure, and their shared role as responsible regional leaders. The outcome is nothing less than a permanent resolution of the border dispute, allowing India-China relations to shift from perpetual rivalry to managed competition or even, ideally, strategic cooperation, unlocking immense potential.
This roadmap sounds incredibly ambitious, almost utopian maybe, but also highly rational in its approach to these deeply entrenched problems. What's the strategic rationale behind pursuing such a difficult path, and what are the major risks and obstacles that could just derail it?
The strategic rationale is compelling, multifaceted. From a security perspective, it profoundly reduces the risk of war in nuclear Asia, paramount for global stability, their own populations. Economically, it reopens trade potential in the Himalayas, unlocking significant cross-border economic opportunities currently stifled by mistrust. Geopolitically, it reduces dependence on other powers for balancing acts, allowing both nations greater strategic autonomy. It also allows for national pride, as both sides can secure symbolic victories, Tawang for India, Aksai Chin for China, and claim to have achieved a historical resolution. And it significantly enhances their global image as responsible great powers capable of resolving complex disputes peacefully. However, the risks and obstacles are substantial, really substantial. There's the danger of hardliner backlash in both countries who might view any compromise as a betrayal of national territory or principle. Imagine the political courage it would take for a leader to make such concessions and face that domestic opposition. Fierce opposition, likely. There's also potential military-industrial resistance to a peace dividend, as reduced tensions could impact defense spending. The political risk of appearing soft on territorial claims is incredibly high for any leader in a democratic India or a nationalistic China. Massive risk. And critically, the ever-present fear of betrayal remains, especially after Galwan, making leaders hesitant to truly trust the other side's commitments, fearing a repeat of past experiences.
So, given all these formidable obstacles and deep historical baggage, what could genuinely enable this ambitious plan to succeed? What are the key factors that could actually make this roadmap a reality, pushing it beyond just theoretical possibility?
The roadmap identifies several crucial enablers for success. Foremost is high-level leadership convergence, meaning leaders like Xi and Modi or their successors would need to align on the strategic imperative of peace and be willing to make difficult political decisions, take those risks. Civil society and academic track 2 diplomacy can play a vital role, building unofficial bridges, generating new ideas, softening public opinion. Regional momentum from multilateral institutions like ESCO and BRICS could provide a supportive framework, pressuring both nations to prioritize regional stability. Support from neutral third parties, perhaps like Norway or Switzerland, could offer objective facilitation and mediation if both sides were to accept it. And finally, a well-executed public messaging strategy would be essential. Preparing both populations for a pragmatic peace, managing expectations, fostering acceptance of compromises, framing it as a win-win rather than a loss for either side. This is a truly bold vision, isn't it? And it just underlines the sheer complexity of untangling decades of historical baggage, these deeply held national narratives. The question that hangs over all of it is, can the will for peace, the strategic rationale for stability, can it ultimately overcome the inertia of suspicion and the powerful political risks of compromise? It asks us to imagine a future where these two giants move beyond the traumas of the past, something that seems a distant dream at times, but is critical for global stability.
What this deep dive really shows you, I think, is that the India-China border isn't just a line on a map. Not at all. It's a living, breathing testament to history, national pride, and the very human challenge of compromise. From the shocking contradictions of 1962 to the nuanced yet incredibly difficult pathways toward peace proposed in this roadmap, we've seen how much is at stake. It's a powerful reminder that even the most enduring, complex, seemingly intractable conflicts, they have origins. And potentially, if enough political will and courage can be mustered, they also have resolutions.
And if we consider this roadmap, one of the most profound takeaways, for me, is that idea. Mountains divide us, but history, faith, and the future bind us. It challenges us to consider if India and China can, truly, not remain prisoners of the past. And that raises an important question for all of us, doesn't it? Not just nations. What historical prisons do we, as individuals or nations, cling to? What outdated grievances or rigid narratives prevent us from moving forward? And what might it take to finally unlock those doors and embrace a new, more constructive future? It's about recognizing that the past, while formative, doesn't always have to dictate the future. Sometimes we have the power to write a new chapter.
We really hope this deep dive has given you some incredible nuggets of knowledge, sparked your curiosity even further. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep getting informed.